All right, we might get started then. So let me share screen if I can. And feel free to chuck anything in the chat if you have questions at any point. So far, all I'm seeing is people's AI assistants taking notes. So, Econ seminar. I presume everyone can see that?
Yep, looks good, thank you.
Okay. Briefly, actually, I should start with who I am. I'm Matt. I'm a debater from Australia. I've been debating for a while, although I'm actually now retired, and did economics at uni, done a lot of economics debates over my life. I'm very, very far from a proper expert, but I think I have a reasonably good grasp of the at least base level economics concepts that are required in debates and how to apply them. So I was asked to come and give a seminar talking about that. So the first thing to establish is that actually a lot of debates are just kind of economics problems. Like a lot of debates are about making a policy decision that will change how a set of actors act, and then making a determination about whether that policy decision and the changes that it has had to how actors act leads to a higher or lower level of net utility in the world. And yes, that isn't always true. Like sometimes we get into principle debates about what kinds of things we should care about more or less, but very often it is just about who can guarantee more utility for more people. And there's, we might say, for instance, that we care more about some group of people, so we might weight their utility more highly. But that doesn't mean that you stop thinking about the debate in the same way. You just have a slight modifier on how much you care about each particular group. So this isn't just for what you might think about as economics debates. I think thinking about a lot of debates through the lens of the kinds of ways that economists talk about problems is quite useful. The second thing to say is that this is not going to be super, super high level. And if I'm honest, I don't think I've ever actually seen someone run a high-level economics argument in a debate. Almost always the economics arguments, and like the people who are the best in the world at this, are not running really, really complicated arguments. What they're doing is they're taking a set of very, very basic facts, applying them to the motion, and then being able to generate an impact. And what those people have is a really good grasp of very basic concepts, not an ability to make arguments about incredibly complicated concepts that are difficult to understand. So this is what I'm going to do tonight. Today, I think in most people's time zones will probably be during the day. It's quite late at night here. First, I'm going to give some general thoughts about how to be good at economics debates. Secondly, I'm going to talk about microeconomics, which is just about agents making utility maximizing decisions, which is the part of this that's applicable to kind of all debates. The third thing that I'm going to talk about is the short run, which is how do we ensure the economy is at equilibrium, make sure that people get jobs and cheap goods. The fourth is I'm going to talk about the long run, which is actually where most economics debates sit, which is how can we make the most stuff and make sure that the most people get it. And then fifth, I'm going to walk through some sort of common economics debate scenarios that you see. And then I'm going to apply the very simple stuff from the first part to those motions and to those motion types and explain how they apply from each side. So I'm going to presume no questions at this stage, but I will open the chat just in case. So my three general thoughts on economics debates is, first of all, avoid any kinds of buzzwords. And be very, very specific with the claims that you're making. The first thing that I'd suggest avoiding is excessively using pronouns to refer to concepts. So saying things like this or that group of people or that outcome gets very, very confusing because economics debates tend to have a lot of different quantities running around. They tend to have a lot of different actors. They tend to have a lot of different outcomes. And when you start saying them or that, it's very, very easy for a judge to get lost. The other thing is economics debates have a lot of words that have different meanings and can be used differently. Have different meanings and can have different outcomes depending on the form of those meanings of that word that you're using. And when you start to get confused between those words, it actually becomes meaningfully difficult for the judge to understand what you're talking about. So I'll give an example of this today. So today I judged a debate about whether or not meat should be banned from being sold. And a core question of that debate, or a core question of the debate that I watched was, can the land that is currently being used to grow either meat or feed for meat be repurposed for other purposes? The affirmative team makes the argument, and the buzzword here is reallocation. Can they prove reallocation? They make an argument at the beginning of the debate that says, well, we can reallocate this to make more food, and we'll make food more efficiently. So therefore, we'll end up with more food overall. So they have proved reallocation, and then having proved reallocation, they've attached a benefit to it, which is more food overall. So I'm like, yep, okay, good. The negative team rebuts this by saying that here's a handful of reasons where you can't reallocate to other kinds of food, and therefore you don't get your benefit. The affirmative team rebuts that and says, well, if that's true, that we can't use it to grow, if what the negative team has said is true, then the government is able to step in and reallocate the land for things like national parks. So that means the affirmative team has successfully been able to prove the buzzword reallocation would happen, but the kind of reallocation is meaningfully different to the kind of reallocation that they identified when they first made the argument, which means that the impact they attach to reallocation, which is more food production, can no longer be claimed. And I think that's a thought I have about a lot of debates, but I think economics debates have a particularly high level of that kind of problem where the word changes meaning throughout the debate, and you can no longer attach the impact that you used to be able to attach to proving that word as an outcome because you've changed the form of that word. So avoid any kind of buzzwords. The second thing to say is that I think you want to avoid any kind of long sentences. So when you're making economics arguments, often it's like a long chain of causation. So you're like, well, X is going to cause Y, which is going to cause Z. And you kind of get these like 35-word long sentences where you're tripping over yourself and you just get completely lost. So the way that I'd like to try and do it is give as short sentences as possible. Just literally say like, X will cause Y, break. Therefore, Y will cause Z, break. Therefore, Z will cause A. And that way there's no way to get lost in the logic. And that means not only is your logic clear to the judge, but if you're forcing yourself to write it out like that, then you also force yourself to be clear on the internal logic of your argument, which means that you're more likely not to make a logical mistake. Because I think very often people think, oh, I get very confused in the way that I explain the arguments, which is sometimes true, but sometimes it's also a cop-out. Sometimes the reason people are unclear in the way they say the argument is that they're unclear of the internal logic of the argument themselves. So forcing yourself to be able to step through in a very, very simple way, also make sure that you're checking yourself to make sure that the logic is correct. The final thing to say about economics debates in general is that impacting is often very difficult when you're making things like efficiency arguments. So if you're making an argument like, the economy is going to be 1% more efficient, that's really unclear what that looks like. So you need sort of shorthands to be able to do it. And Dan Yim, who's an Australian debater, I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar with him, has, I think, a great little sentence to do this, which is he says, kilometers are comprised of centimeters. And what he's essentially trying to get at is that over time, small differences in the levels of efficiency pile up on each other and lead to enormous outcomes. So if there's a 1% growth differential over 25 years, that's a meaningfully large difference in the standard of living in a particular country. The problem is because it's kind of unintuitive to judges that matters heaps, you need to really step them through it. And you can do the expression I've heard for this is you hang a lantern on it. So you explain, this might seem counterintuitive and unimportant, but it's not. 1% changes in efficiency compound over time to enormous differences in the quality of living, such that it's the biggest impact in this debate. So that's my set of sort of general thoughts on how to do well at econ debates once you understand things. Let's now talk about agents maximizing utility. So an agent is just like a person or a firm or anyone who's able to take an action and has an outcome that they want from that action. As a baseline, we tend to assume that people will make the choice that's in their best interest. And the extension of that is that choice maximization is also utility maximizing. So if people have 5 choices, then they will opt into the one that leads to the best. Yes, thank you, Abra. That's true. Dan did. He did very, very well at Nepal Australs. So if you provide people with more choices, then you will also provide people with higher utility because they'll naturally opt into the choice that leads to the most utility for them. I'll note here, I'm about to step through this very, very mathematically. Obviously, you don't in actual debates be like, well, this would lead to a +2 utility for this actor. But even though people aren't explicitly saying the number, right? The way that kind of everyone is thinking about debates is they're thinking about quantities of harms and benefits and then getting rough levels of them against each other by doing weighing. So they'll be like, oh, there's X harm and X benefit, and you've explained why one is more important than the other. So like everyone kind of implicitly is doing some form of quantification. That doesn't mean in debates you should be like, well, they're going to experience +4 utiles or whatever, but it is good to think about it in this general way. So let's do an example of how utility maximization through choice works. Mum is optimizing to maximize the utility of all 6 children. And mum here can be a stand-in for the adjudicator of the debate, deciding whether or not X policy is overall good, right? Because a government or the adjudicator just wants like the best outcomes for everyone. So our choice here is to have soup or not to have soup. We have 2 kinds of actors. We have actors who love soup, the blue actors, 1 utility with soup, 0 if they get nothing, or a set of actors who hate soup, -2 utility with soup, 0 without soup. And they're split 50-50 in our population. Now, if we say that there's no choice available, then both actors will only have 1 choice. They'll get 0 payoff. They'll both take that choice. All of our actors in the population will end up taking no soup. They will get 0 utility. However, if we give them the choice between having soup or not having soup, then both of them will get 0 from not having soup, but the payoff to having soup is higher for the blue actors and lower for the red actors. So only the blue actors will opt in and the red actors will not opt in. So we get high utility because the red actors aren't disadvantaged. They remain at 0 utility. The blue actors are advantaged because they have been able to go over and get soup. Each of them gets 1 utility for a total of 3 utility. So overall, if we give them the choice to have soup, we get 3 utility in the system. If we don't give them the choice to have soup, we get 0 utility in the system. So yes, it's clearly better. The adjudicator should decide that we do want soup to be available to everyone. So the conclusion is just like choice is amazing. Every time you give someone choice, you get more utility for everyone. You should always vote for the side that maximizes choice. That is kind of the baseline assumption that we make. But there's then a series of ways that that breaks down. Let's talk about coercion then. Coercing Y into making decision X involves changing Y's base case so that the case they would have had access to were the choice not to be available is meaningfully worse than the choice that they have access to by not taking the new choice that is introduced. So if you're just making it so that if you're offering an incentive, which is you're making that choice better, then everyone will have to still end up better off, because if it's true that taking the option is better than the base case, then they'll take it and it'll be better. If it's true that it's worse than the base case, then they'll just take the base case and end up at the same scenario. So assuming that after offering the option of not opting in to that option with the same level of no additional harm done to you still exists, it's highly unlikely to be coercion. So let's introduce a new fact into our soup game. Your dad really wants you to have soup so that you grow up to be a big, strong boy. And he experiences -2 utility if you go hungry and +2 utility if you have soup. And note, this is completely disconnected. His utility function is completely disconnected from your utility function. He doesn't care that you're happy. What he cares about is that you are meeting the thing that he wants. So he can threaten to take away your video games if you don't choose soup, and you'll believe him, right? So you'll experience -5 utility if your dad takes away your video game. So that's something that you want to avoid. So notice here, dad has now altered our base case, right? We no longer have the option of just saying no and keeping the 0 utility, because if we say no, we move to -5 utility from using our video games. And our dad is going to choose whether or not to make the threat based on what maximizes his own utility. So let's step through this problem. So we already know that if we don't give a choice, in which case obviously no threat can be made, we get 0 utility. If we can make a choice and no threat is made, which is the first scenario we walk through, we'll get 3 utility. So let's figure out what dad's utility is under each of these cases. So if there's no soup, then there's 0 utility for the children and no one is going to have soup. And here, Dad's going to experience -12 utility because he has -2 utility per child that doesn't have soup. So he's really, really angry, which is bad. But if there is a choice of whether or not to have soup, Dad's actually going to get more utility. He's going to get 0 utility here because he experienced +2 utility for everyone who did have soup and -2 utility for everyone who didn't have soup. So he prefers there being a choice because he wants as many people as possible to have soup. Now, what if he does make the threat though? How does that change his utility? How does that change the level of utility he experiences? So if Dad makes his threat, now the utility for each actor actually changes, because if they choose not to have soup, then they'll lose their video games. So they'll go to -5. And the upshot of that is that the payoff to not having soup is actually -5. And the payoff to having soup is -2 or 1 for the actor who does like having the soup in the first instance. Which means now actually both of them are going to choose to have the soup. Because previously our actors who didn't like soup would have not had it because it has -2, sorry, they would have not had it because it's 0 utility as opposed to -2 utility. But now we've altered the base case where you don't have the soup and you have -5 utility. So they both have to have the soup, which means now everyone is going to end up in the having soup bundle because it's the best decision. And we're going to get -3 utility because it's +3 for the set of people who like soup, but it's -2 per person, so -6 overall for the people who don't like it, which leads to -3 utility overall. But it's 12 utility for Dad because everyone had soup, so he's super happy. So this is the result of our game, which is Dad's utility is highest if he does make the threat, and that actually leads to the lowest utility for the children though, because they're coerced into having soup that they didn't want to have. So what happens? We have 2 actors who can decide here. We can have Mum, who decides if you have soup as an option, and then we have Dad, who, if soup is an option, decides if he should make the threat. Because there's no reason for him to make the threat if the option doesn't exist. He makes the threat because he wants everyone to have soup. But if no one has the option to have soup and it can't work, there's no reason for him to make the threat. And you can think of this scenario as quite common in a lot of debates where Mum is the adjudicator, right? She's deciding whether the motion, which either choice maximizes or choice minimizes, is a good thing or a bad thing. And she's going to make her decision, and she knows if we allow a choice to be made, then an actor may or may not do coercion to change how people will respond to that choice. So at the end of each of these sort of trees of choice, we end up with one of these 3 options here. So if there's no soup, we get this bottom one here. Sorry, these colors are actually wrong, I've just realized. But if there's no soup, we get this bottom one here, in which there's no choice, no child utility, and Dad's utility doesn't matter. Mum's not concerned about Dad's utility. She wants the children to be happy, in the same way that the adjudicator isn't concerned about the utility of the coercive influence in a debate. The adjudicator is concerned about the utility of the people who are coerced. If the soup is made available and no threat is made, we get the highest utility. So there's 3 child utility, but Dad experiences 0 utility. If soup is made available and the threat is made, then we get -3 child utility and 12 Dad utility. So we know, so at the end of the debate, the adjudicator, in this case, Mum deciding whether or not to make soup, knows that if soup is made available, then Dad will get the decision whether or not to coerce. And she can observe and figure out that Dad experiences more utility if he does coerce than if he doesn't coerce. So Dad is going to choose to coerce, which shrinks Mum's problem to this, because she knows Dad will coerce if he gets the option. So if the soup comes out, Dad will do the coercion, we'll get -3 child utility. And if we don't, it becomes 0 utility. And there's actually no way for Mum to access the highest utility option, which is soup available, no coercion. So given that, Mum is going to choose no soup because actually that leads to the better outcome. And there's lots of scenarios where this is true in debating, right? There's lots of scenarios where we're trying to allow an actor to make a particular choice, and we need to decide whether or not they're going to make that choice freely to know whether or not that choice should be allowed. So for instance, in the debate that we should allow people to do really, really dangerous jobs, and there's lots of versions of that debate, there's a question, if they could opt in perfectly, clearly it would be good to allow them to do those really dangerous jobs because they would only opt in where it was beneficial for them. But if we determine that there is likely to be coercion to coerce them into those jobs, even though the best outcome is allow them to do the jobs, have no coercion, clearly that isn't going to be on the table. Therefore, we should actually make the decision not to allow them to do the job at all because we know the coercion will happen. And essentially then that creates a double burden on one team who's trying to run the coercion argument. They must prove, firstly, that the coercion is within the incentive of the coercive party. And secondly, they need to prove that that coercion leads to lower total utility outcomes than if you didn't provide the choice in the first instance. So this, obviously, the soup example is not going to come up, but I thought it was a simple way of showing the way in which coercion works. And crucially, it's different to the provision of an incentive because an incentive leaves the whole system better off than if you didn't provide the original outcome, or than if you didn't provide the option. But coercion leaves everyone worse off. So in this case, you end up with 0 utility or -3 utility instead of the original 3 utility from people opting in. But imagine a case in which, for instance, Dad had said, I'll pay you the pocket money additionally to have the soup. Then you still would have got everyone opting into the soup in this world. But now, because you get your pocket money, it would have gone from 1 to 6 and -2 to 3, which then would have meant actually everyone ends up way better off because it's like 6 times 3 plus 3 times 3. I don't want to do the maths in my head right now, but everyone would have ended up way better off. So you end up with a better outcome under an incentive, but a worse outcome under coercion. And remember that the key distinction is about whether or not the base case changes. One important extension to whether or not coercion can work is the credibility of the threat. How much do the actors who are under the influence of the threat believe that the threat would actually be carried out if they did choose to do the thing that the actor didn't want, or the coercing actor didn't want? So often, the reason you know that someone will follow through on a threat is because they want to establish the credibility of that threat into the future. So therefore, you know they'd follow through if you do it. The exception to that is in one-shot games where this pattern is only going to be repeated once. There is no future instance for which they would build credibility. So there's actually no reason for them to follow through on the threat. And if that's true, then following through on the threat actually needs to be in their best interest, even after you've made the decision. Which is not always true. Like sometimes following through on a threat is clearly not in your best interest if you can no longer change the decision of the original actor. But there's a lot of different mechanisms that get designed to get around this problem. For instance, sometimes people design mechanisms in advance that give them no choice, that automatically make decisions for them, or they assign punishments to themselves through, for instance, legal mechanisms. So there's a debate about Ulysses contracts, which people opt in advance to punishments for themselves later, which then provides credibility because it does become within their best interest to allow that threat, to follow through on that threat. But often, where it's not a one-shot game, where this is going to be repeated, the way you establish the credibility of a threat is, have they done this thing before? So the conclusion of this is that if someone's going to coerce you, then to act against your best interests, actually often having no option is better. And this is a microcosm of probably about like 15 to 20% of debates you're ever going to do, is this trade-off of whether or not choice maximization is good, because can people actually opt in correctly? Remembering again the distinction between coercion and incentive. For instance, offering someone a job with money is not a coercive influence because it increases everyone's total utility from the base case. It is, for instance, if you said you were going to rob someone of money that they would have had existingly, were they not to take the option, which then makes the base case worse because it's no longer don't do job versus do job. It's do job versus don't do job and get robbed, which is clearly leaving you worse off. I will note here that these two problems can cancel each other out. So if someone is incorrectly optimizing for their own best interest, then a benevolent coercive force can force them towards the optimal outcome for themselves. But you are obviously then creating a lot of argumentative burdens for yourself, explaining why that person is benevolent, why they're correctly able to ascertain people's best interests, why they would be able then to actually coerce people into the relevant outcome. There's another set of arguments you can make that people are unable to determine their own best interest. There's a lot of kind of generic analysis that gets run on this, like, oh, people are dumb, oh, people, are they're going to have social narratives from their parents and things. But that analysis tends not to be winning in the vast majority of debates, just because, and I don't necessarily think that this is a good thing, but judges have a bias against analysis which they consider to be unsophisticated and which they think they've heard before many times and people are copy and pasting. So you're generally not going to win on that kind of generic analysis. There's two kind of other things that I think often do play in judges' minds, though. The first is about arguing about the incentives of the information provider. So if you are reliant on a party for information, but that party also has interests in you acting one particular way, then they probably provide you with information that leads you to believe that you need to act in that way. And therefore you don't have the information required to assess your own self-interest. So if my optometrist both evaluates whether or not I need glasses and makes money if I buy the glasses, then he's probably going to tell me that I need glasses because he wants me to buy them, and therefore I lack the relevant information to be able to make that decision. The other thing you can argue about is whether or not people correctly weigh competing incentives. So there's arguments about people have certain biases. They have biases towards the short term. They have biases towards what they find exciting. The problem with that analysis is that it actually gets into quite a deep kind of philosophical question about whether or not those biases are people incorrectly optimizing for their own best interest in a way that we ought to stop them from doing so, or is it that this is someone actualizing their own self-interest and we should allow them to make the decision that that is within their best interests? A couple of other problems with utility optimization then. We're talking about bundling, which is often firms will choose to say, we sell X product and Y product, and we're going to put them together and make you purchase them together. So if there's no bundling, let's say there's two firms, firm A and firm B, and they both sell goods in market 1 and market 2. If no one bundles, you can choose A in both markets, B in both markets, A in the first market, B in the second, B in the first market, A in the second market. But if they bundle them together, I can only choose A in one market or B in one market. The problem with that then is that if the highest utility option for me is A1, B2 or B1, A2, then I'm not able to maximize my own best interests by making that decision. So in that case, you end up with much lower utility. Okay, that's the micro stuff. Now let's talk about more macroeconomics, which is the economy overall, how much stuff is made, money, capital markets, things like that. So there's broadly sort of two periods or two lengths of time that we want to talk about in economics debates. The short run is about how much money, how high is employment right now, how many people are employed, how much are we making in the short term, and how stable are prices, so inflation. Are they being kept at the same level? I'll note this is distinct from questions about like how much we can make, how that is distributed into the long term, because those are questions that are typically not decided by the same mechanisms of short run wanting to return the economy to equilibrium. But debating very often confuses the long run with the short run, right? So you very often see arguments being made that are like, well, we need to increase demand because that will lead to an increase in supply when we are able to like have supply increase to that demand because firms will want to make a good, and therefore everyone will make more stuff. The problem with that is that typically the economy is somewhere around equilibrium, which is that the total amount of potential output, like the capacity of the economy, is currently being met. And then in very short run cycles, we deviate from that short run equilibrium and we need to get it back to that. But we're still fundamentally constrained in the short run by the total capacity of the economy. So increasing aggregate demand doesn't help make more stuff if the economy is already at its maximum productive capacity. So arguments that are often useful in specific contexts, like a crisis when there's a dearth of aggregate demand, are often run like they are long run arguments that continue to benefit into the long term. And like just almost all debates are about the long run, right? Like almost all debates are about, should we make this long-term policy change into the indefinite future about how society is run, which means you're very infrequently actually running short-run arguments. So I want to talk about the short run anyway, before we get into the far more important long-run arguments. The first thing to say about the short run is that the core ideas are aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So how much overall is the economy making is aggregate supply, and aggregate demand is how much is the economy demanding in terms of goods at the moment. So there's two possible problems with this. The first possible problem is that aggregate demand is outstripping aggregate supply. So the economy is currently demanding more goods than are being provided by the economy. The problem with that is that because we can't actually increase the total productive capacity of the economy in the short run, that requires things like investment in capital or labor. If there's too much demand and not enough goods, prices just need to increase. And there's two key types of inflation that are important in debates. The first is cost push inflation. So cost push inflation is where it gets more expensive to make a thing. So that might be because, there's an increase in wages for the workers in that area. It might be because there's been some kind of natural disaster which has wiped out the number of things of that type that still exist, which means they're now going to cost more. It might be because it's more expensive to ship things because international shipping is down because there's a war. But something that exogenously increases the cost of a good can push inflation. The second kind of inflation, which is the more relevant one to aggregate demand and supply, is, well, I suppose they are actually both relevant to aggregate demand and supply, because what I've just been describing, where you have less of it because of a natural disaster or shipping, or because it's more expensive to make because of labor, suggests that aggregate supply has gone down quite a bit, which means there's now more aggregate demand. But the second kind is aggregate supply hasn't gone down, it's remained at capacity. It's just that aggregate demand has really increased so much. And the reason for that could be like government spending has occurred a lot. So a lot of extra money has been increased into the economy. Could be that the central bank has made interest rates lower. But in that case, inflation is going to happen through the second type of important inflation, which is demand pull inflation. So there's too much demand and it needs to pull up the prices. The second thing that's important about inflation is that it is expectations augmented. So the idea is that in general, inflation will go up by however much the economy expects it to. And that's because businesses, if they expect prices to go up, will increase their own prices. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, because the businesses know that their input costs are probably going to go up by that much, so they need to get the amount of money that they have coming in increased to match it. And secondly, they know that the market expects the prices to go up, so consumers aren't likely to stop buying their good if the price does go up, because everyone's expecting it to go up. It's also often viewed as a type of collusion. So one of the kind of core principles of markets is you're supposed to have a whole bunch of firms competing with each other to provide the cheapest possible price for the highest quality possible, and then consumers will buy from whoever's the lowest price and the highest quality. So therefore, you're incentivized to provide the highest quality and the lowest cost. However, that ends up bleeding the margins for the firms down to effectively zero, because if they all keep competing for the lowest price, then they'll keep competing it down until the point where they're making zero profit. And that's where they obviously have no more room to reduce it. Otherwise, they'd lose money and have to go out of business. So it's actually more profitable for firms not to compete with each other, to all collude to set the price. Now, that's obviously illegal in most jurisdictions. And the problem with it, the reason why they don't just collude all the time, is because if all of you decided to collude, then one person or one firm could simply break out of that collusion. And then, having broken out of that collusion, they would get all of the money, which is because every consumer will go to them because they're so much cheaper, which is why more firms is typically better for competition, because it means it's harder to collude because it's more likely that one person would defect and lower their prices. The issue that you run into with inflation expectations, and this is one view of inflation, but I think it's an informative one, is that inflation expectations essentially allow firms to collude on price increases. Because if they all raise their prices at inflation and they all know that their prices are going to be raised at inflation, that's a way for them to coordinate. Because you can't obviously write an email to the CEO of another firm and be like, let's all raise our prices the same amount. Wouldn't that be great? We'll screw the consumer, because that would be illegal and the regulator would take you to court. But if you all implicitly assume that everyone else is going to raise their prices at inflation, then you've like signaled to each other in a way that you're allowed to or can get away with to collude, which is why in some markets, you're actually not allowed to talk about price increases. So for instance, one example is that in Australia, before interest rates are cut, bank CEOs aren't allowed to directly say whether or not they will pass on interest rate cuts. And the reason for that is that you don't want them saying it publicly and then signaling to each other as a form of collusion that they're not going to pass on the cost, because not passing on an interest rate increase would be essentially meaning like a real terms price increase, because the bank would have a lower cost of their capital but get the same return on their capital from their customers. So that would effectively be a price increase in the same way. But that's just one way of colluding. Sorry, I know that's a lot of background to explain the kind of collusion argument, but I think it's important anyway and maybe useful in and of its own right. The other important idea is that since inflation is expectations augmented, the idea is that it's not that there's a relationship between the level of inflation and the level of unemployment or output. It's actually that there's a relationship between the increase or decrease year on year of inflation and the level of output, which means that, so unemployment is obviously linked to output because the number of people employed changes how much is produced. And the idea is you have this NAIRU, which is the level of employment that will not increase the level of inflation. I think it's the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment is what the 5 letters stand for. So what that level of unemployment actually is changes over time as characteristics of the economy change. But basically, what you're trying to get to is a level where you have your gross level of inflation at some predetermined target, usually between 2 and 3%, and then you get output to whatever the NAIRU is to keep it there. And then when the inflation falls out of your target level, if it's above your target level, then you have to increase unemployment, which reduces output to then bring inflation back into line, and then you can bring output back to potential. Or if inflation is too low, then you cut output, then you increase unemployment, which cuts output, and then raises inflation back to the target level. So basically, in the steady state, you have output and unemployment at the NAIRU, and you have inflation within the target. And then as inflation bobs in and out of the target, you use the level of output and employment to move it back to within the target. Now, because it is expectations augmented, one important thing that's discussed in inflation is keeping long-run inflation expectations anchored. So you want to make sure that the entire population has trust that the government and the central bank is going to bring inflation back to its target, which means that people won't assume inflation is going to go into the long run. The reason that's important is that if they think it will go into the long run, it actually will go into the long run, because if people think it will, they keep rising their prices. So keeping the credibility of inflation expectations anchored at the target is really important. And the fact that it's expectations augmented is actually why most central banks will preference trying to control inflation over trying to control unemployment. Because unemployment is relatively easy to bring up or down at different times by pulling on different policy levers. But inflation, once expectations get de-anchored from the population believing they'll come back to target, and once the expectation continues to build on itself into the future, you can get just runaway inflation, which is how you get things like hyperinflation. Now, what are the harms of inflation? First of all, they reduce certainty because you don't know how much return you'll have on your investments, and businesses are generally risk averse, so an increase in uncertainty also reduces total investment. But also wages typically play catch up to prices. And the reason for that is that wages are much stickier than prices. That means they change much less frequently. And that's because like prices are usually set at a whim by a business, but wages are often set as part of long-run enterprise bargaining agreements. Workers don't have as much bargaining power as firms, so they're less able to bargain to get their wages increased in the short term. So because wages typically are behind prices in inflation, the amount that inflation, so like in the long run, wages will rise to be with inflation. But because they typically are a step behind, the year-on-year change in inflation is very important. Because if inflation is 1.5% a year, then maybe they're 1.5% behind. Obviously, those numbers are not correct because things change. But like, if it's 1.5% inflation, then maybe you're 1.5% behind. But if it's 5% inflation, then all of a sudden your wages are rising 5% less than the cost of living. So you do meaningfully have less money to spend in the short term because wages are much stickier than prices are. Second thing then. So that's one type of crisis. You have inflation where aggregate demand is larger than aggregate supply. The second one is you have an unemployment crisis where aggregate demand is below the level of supply. And that's because supply shrinks to how much demand there is. So if, there's not enough people trying to buy a thing, firms are going to stop making that thing, and then people are laid off. And this is a case in which the economy is below the level of potential output I was talking about before. And that is called there being slack in the economy, which is just like there's people sitting around not doing things, there's machines sitting around not producing things. And the problem with this is that it can be cyclical. Firms lose money, those firms lay off workers, workers lose money, they spend less, and therefore firms lose money. And then you just spin yourself down into a cycle where everyone keeps losing money hand over fist, and the economy is essentially unable to recover. So that is the second kind of crisis, probably the most common kind of crisis discussed in debating. Think, for instance, the GFC or the Great Depression. So how do we step in to solve that? Sorry, I keep on accidentally bringing up someone's Otter AI thing. The first is fiscal policy, which is where the government chooses to spend a bunch of money. So the government spends a bunch of money on things, therefore that increases demand. What are the benefits of doing fiscal policy? Firstly, it can be targeted to help people who need it the most. So, if we're having a crisis and people are really struggling, like in the most dead brain way, we can give money to people who are doing it tough and therefore their lives get better. Like the logic is that simple. And that's specific to fiscal policy, which can be much more targeted than the alternative I'm talking about of monetary policy. The reason for that is that the government can just choose to give money to a person, right? They can just be like, I'm going to give money to this set of people in this community, or to everyone who earns less than X income, or to all unemployed people. Like they can very aggressively target it. But the second benefit is that it can have really good long-run benefits. So often what governments are trying to do is they're like, okay, the problem is there's not enough stuff being made right now. There's not enough demand. We need to increase the demand by giving people money. But you can get a double benefit because you can just give people money and then they can spend it and then you'll fix demand, done. But you can also use that period of time while you're fixing the crisis to try and build a bunch of things that are really, really useful. So for instance, in Australia during the GFC, they wanted to give people jobs and money, and while they did just do some unconditional cash transfers, they also did a lot of public spending on building new facilities for schools, which gets a double benefit. You pay a person to make the thing, and therefore they have the money, increases demand. That's good. But also, you've now just got a whole bunch of new schools that have been built. So you're able to get a double benefit. The kind of wacky thing about fiscal policy is that in the set of examples I've just given you, or the sort of framework I've just given you, you would assume that if there's an inflationary crisis, you would cut spending, you would lower fiscal policy, because that fiscal policy would lead you to have more inflation if you spent more money. But it's actually the opposite in a lot of cases, because increased spending also then allows you to help people who are struggling the most. So often you do things like spend on subsidies for things that were expensive, which increases demand for those things and doesn't help with the inflationary crisis. But governments have short-term political incentives to help people out through that cost of living crisis, which means they actually increase spending at a time when the problem is too much spending, and then leave the monetary policy to do the hard yards. But maybe that's good, because monetary policy can lead everyone to dilute their level of spending, and then the fiscal policy can be directed towards the people who really need it, so that those people don't have to bear the brunt of decreased spending. And the second kind of policy is monetary policy, and this is typically done by central banks. And central banks in most jurisdictions are independent of the government. And the reason for that is that the political incentives for interest rates, which is what monetary policy is, are just kind of whack, because there's a huge incentive to cut interest rates in the short term before your election such that you can get re-elected. So because the political incentives were so misaligned, most jurisdictions decided to make their central banks independent. So essentially what monetary policy is trying to do is it's attempting to try and set the short-term risk-free rate for financial instruments in that economy. So there's a whole bunch of instruments. So a financial instrument is like, I buy this instrument and then I receive a return on buying that financial instrument. So I buy a bond and I pay $100 for it, and then when the bond matures, I make $110. And the rate at which my money gets turned into more money by buying financial instruments is the return on that financial instrument. There's a set of those instruments that are considered to be essentially risk-free, because we know for certain you'll get paid back. And the rate on those is what's typically called the risk-free rate. And there's lots of different ways there's lots of different things that are considered the risk-free rate in different jurisdictions. So for instance, in Australia, we call it the cash rate, which is the rate that banks will lend money to each other in overnight money markets. But in different places, they have different iterations of what the risk-free rate is. But essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to set the rate that you can loan money on an incredibly short-term basis that is totally risk-free. And then having set the risk-free rate, they also set the interest rate on every other instrument within the economy. And the reason for that is that for me to hold a financial instrument, I need to receive enough payoff to justify the amount riskier that is than the risk-free rate, right? So if I'm 3% riskier than the risk-free rate and the risk-free rate is 2%, I need to pay a 5% interest rate. But now if the risk-free rate becomes 4%, why would I lend at 5% to someone 3% riskier than that, right? Because it's not worth my return. Like the risk that I'm having to take on isn't worth the fact I'm only getting 1% above risk-free. So everything kind of gets priced off that risk-free rate. And it typically is the short-term risk-free rate, but there's also some cases where they do unconventional monetary policy, where they do try and, for instance, intervene in markets with riskier assets, or they try and, so that makes it not the risk-free rate. They'll do it for riskier assets, or sometimes they don't try and set the short-term rate. So they do, so for instance, yield curve control. The yield curve is the relationship between how long to maturity this asset is, so how long before I get my money back, and how much money I'm going to get back at the end of that. And yield curve control is not trying to change the short-term risk-free rate. It's trying to change the longer-term rate for assets within the economy. And typically the reason that's done is because monetary policy runs into what's called the zero lower bound problem, which is if the risk-free rate is already essentially zero, there's nowhere else I can go. So I need to pursue more unconventional monetary policy. How does monetary policy then actually impact on the real economy? So it will increase the interest rates for everything in the economy, but how does that actually lead to less aggregate demand then? It's the relevant question. 5 key ways. Firstly, you get less investment because it's more expensive to invest. So if it costs me more, if the cost of capital to buy my new machine is higher, then I'm less likely to buy my new machine, so I spend less money. Secondly, you get less spending if consumer credit is more expensive. So if it costs more to, I don't know, I guess Afterpay is no interest rate, but like if it costs more for me to put my money on my credit card, I'm less likely to purchase things on consumer credit, or systems like lay-by, for instance. Means you get less direct consumer spending where people are accessing consumer credit. Thirdly, payments on my existing liabilities with variable rates are larger, so I have less money to spend. So lots of debt that people have exists at a variable rate where how much they have to repay depends on what the risk-free rate in that economy is at a particular time. So for instance, there's differences in this from economy to economy. So in Australia, typically your mortgage rate moves as the cash rate change. In some countries, you lock in for 30 years. But the mechanism exists most powerfully where the rate is variable. So if my repayments on all my existing debts go up because the interest rate's gone up, then I have less money to spend, which means I can spend less money, reduces spending, reduces aggregate demand. Thirdly, there's an exchange rate channel. So if there's a higher return on my bonds because the risk-free rate has gone up, then more people are going to want to buy my bonds. They need to buy my bonds they need to buy my currency to buy my bonds. If they buy my currency, then the value of my currency goes up. If the value of my currency goes up, then there's less demand from external people to buy goods from my country because the cost of them has gone up, which means there's less demand for my goods. Therefore, aggregate demand goes lower. The final one is the wealth channel, which is that when rates go higher, asset prices tend to dip because it's more expensive to invest in those assets, which makes everyone poorer. And families that are poorer are less likely to want to spend money because they know they have less money as a backstop to sell off if they ran into financial trouble. So when rates go up, families spend less. Similarly, when rates go down, that means it's easier to purchase assets, so asset prices go up, and that means families become way richer, and way richer families are more willing to spend money. So that explains how monetary policy impacts on the actual real economy and the level of demand. But I'll note, very few debates are about the short run. A lot of arguments in debating are made like the ones I've just given you, and the correct response is, well, it's not good to increase demand because we're probably already at capacity in most cases, unless it's a crisis. Why are we just needlessly increasing demand? The actual question is how much stuff can we make? The long run. This is what affects most debates. There's really two important questions in economics debates. First, how much stuff can we make? And secondly, how do we distribute all of that stuff that we've made? The first thing to establish here is there's like a baseline idea here is the efficient market. And the idea is you have consumers who know what they want, and those consumers are able to choose what they want and access the best good for themselves. And firms then want to compete against each other to provide the best good because they will then get all of the market share and then they will be able to make the most money. There's obviously, this is not always the case. For instance, sometimes there are barriers to entry, which means it's hard to enter a market to provide new goods. So the existing firm can monopolize that market. And if there's no competition, there's no reason for me to lower my prices because everyone 100% has to buy from me. But that is dependent on how difficult it is to enter the market. If anyone can enter and start competing with me, then I have to dip my prices because if I increase them, someone else will. If it's really hard to because it's really expensive, might be one reason why you can't enter. There's a high capital cost. Another reason might be that there's like licensing, which only lets so many people enter that market, which is a good argument against licensing, which means that the level of competition is lower. So therefore that breaks down. Another reason is network effects sometimes break things down, where the reason you can't compete is because even if there's a better option, the value of a particular option is dependent on the number of people going to that option. So for instance, think of a social media site. Really, the value of the social media site isn't like the website, it's how many people are on it. And that creates a collective action problem where everyone would like to jump, but no one wants to be the first one to jump. So they are unwilling to actually move over. And therefore, the firm that isn't as good maintains their status just because they have all the users. Although I note that doesn't really apply super well to social media websites because typically you can be on more than one social media at once. So everyone does slowly bleed over. And that's why we have seen a lot of changes in social media websites. So efficient markets then. The question is, how much stuff can we make? This is also called productivity. And this is also by far the most important question in economics debates or in economics in general. Now, there's three relevant sub-questions in how much stuff can we make. Firstly, how much capital do we have? Which is how many like machines, how many computers, etc. do we have that allows people to make things? Secondly, labor. How many people and how good are they at their jobs to making things? And thirdly, matching efficiency. How can we best match the best workers to the best workers to where they can be most productive and make the most stuff? So the basic idea, labor and capital combine to make stuff. So for instance, this guy in this hard hat uses this jackhammer to make a road. Or more commonly today, honestly, it looks like someone sitting at a desk in a tie is using a laptop and they are using it to make like a financially engineered option or whatever. But it is at some point the same thing, right? It's a person, and they're using a physical thing to create an output. And that is basically all of production. So the first question is then, how much capital? The first thing to note is that it's just about how much money is currently being used. So there's actually, capital is used to mean a lot of different things, but there's money, which is like financial capital, but then we need to turn a way to turn that, but you can't like make a good using a $100 bill, right? So we need to find a way to turn that money into machines that can be used by people to produce goods. So the first thing is how much money is put into that investment. So how much money is made available so that you can invest in buying a new machine or building a new factory. Note here there's a distinction between capital expenditure on new machinery that will increase your productive capacity into the future and expenditure on your operating expenses, which is just like which is like paying the wages of your workers or whatever. So there's how much money is made available for capital expenditure. The second thing is investment efficiency. So how well can firms use the money that they're given and turn it into actual usable capital, right? And a lot of that is dependent on how good the management is. So firms with professional management tend to deploy their capital a lot better into, like, they tend to turn the money that they're given into actual usable machines a lot better than firms who are run by, for instance, the original founder owners, right? So that's to say, like, if I'm just like, if I created this business but I have no management experience and I get a bunch of investments, I might be like, yeah, like, let's go get a new swanky office in the high street, and that's going to make all the problems. But someone a bit cleverer might be like, oh, maybe there's better ways to deploy this capital, which is also the argument for things like management consultants, which is they allow people who maybe themselves don't have the knowledge to know how to deploy their capital to be able to deploy it efficiently, which increases the overall productive efficiency of the economy. The final thing is about capital allocation. So is the money given to firms who can best use it to generate the most productive capital? So an important question for that is how many different options, how well can you match the people with the money to the people who need the money? And the reason that the incentive is internalized well by the people with the money is that if you give it to someone who's definitely going to be able to use it to get a return, then they're definitely going to pay you back at the end of it. Whereas if you give it to someone who isn't going to be able to make a return, then they're less likely to pay you back. So from the side of the investor, I want to pick someone who can use it productively because I'll get the most return. But that's also good for society because society now gets the capital allocated such that they can get the maximum possible return, right? So that's why the incentives are well aligned. And this is also the argument for why you should have the free flow of capital, because it might be true that all of the capital is in one country, but all of the good opportunities is in another country. So the way to get the maximum productivity for everyone is to allow the capital to get from the place where it is to the place where it can be the most productive. So that's how you answer how much capital. There's essentially a market for capital, right? So in this market, the price is the interest rate because the price of money is how much you have to pay back for it. And then the quantity is how much capital is raised. So the higher the interest rate, the less firms want to borrow, but the more that people want to lend their money to firms because the higher return that they'll get on their firms. On the other side, the lower it is, the more that firms would want to borrow, but also the less that people would want to provide it because they're not getting as much return. So the market clears at some point where the interest rate meets the amount of capital raised. So how does this market actually look? From the side of someone who wants a bunch of money, there's broadly 3 ways that I can interact with the capital market to be able to get a return on my money. The first is I can buy a bond. So the way that a bond works is that I issue a piece of paper which says, I'm going to pay you back after X years at Y interest rate. And usually as the issuer of a bond, I work with a financial institution who will help you figure out what terms to issue on. They'll buy the whole bond issue from you and then distribute that out to people in the market. The second is that I can give a loan. So I can go to an institution and say, hey, I want some money. And they'll say, sure, we'll lend it to you at X interest rate. And sometimes this isn't just one institution. And here, credit to Kat Cheng for explaining to me how syndicated loans work. Sometimes you borrow from a lot of different lenders and there's one or more joint lead managers who organizes it, negotiates the terms both with the borrower and with all of the other members of the lending team, and they will then loan you the money. I will note in both cases, both the bonds and the loans are then often tied up into more complicated financial instruments, which into the long term are then end up in investment portfolios for people. The third, which is close, it's slightly different, but it's equity markets. So I can issue shares of my firm and I get money in exchange. The dynamics here are slightly different to the generic capital market because you also get control of my business and a share of my profits as opposed to just getting paid back a fixed rate. So it's a slightly different, but it's nonetheless a mechanism by which people can get access to money to invest if they need it. The issuance of more shares. I want to touch a note here on how the capital market has changed a lot since the GFC, which is that bonds have become a relatively larger part of the capital market relative to loans. So it used to be that it was more common that you go to a big bank, get a loan, then that bank would sell on your loan as a financial product. But now firms issuing, or actually just buying a bond is far more common. And that's driven by two things. The first is the massive explosion in US debt, which has meant there's way more US treasuries on the market. You can see here, that is this red line here, which is government securities from the United States. And the second is in corporate debt being issued by the Eurozone, which has meant more European companies are issuing bonds to the market rather than going for loans. And that's shown here by this, purple dotted line showing the massive increase. And these are all normalized to be 100 in Q1 of 2000. So that's kind of a note on how it's changed quite a lot since the GFC. Now, how do you interact with the capital market from the other side of the ledger, from being the owner of some capital who wants to lend it out? First of all, I can make deposits at a bank who will then lend it out as loans. Secondly, I can invest myself. So it might be like retail investment, where I'm just going on Robinhood, or it might be that I'm a high net worth individual who has a very sophisticated family office is what it's called, which is when you just have a set of people's money being invested in a sophisticated way for themselves through a little institution they've set up for themselves. Or I can make an allocation to an institution who will invest it for me. They'll take a portion of my money and a portion of my returns, but they'll hopefully invest it better for me, and then I'll receive a portion of that return. I want to note how this has also changed since the GFC, which is that non-bank financial institutions, so that's things like private credit firms or private equity firms, are now a far larger portion of the market than they used to be. So this graph here shows who holds foreign exchange swaps, which is only one type of financial instruments used to hedge risk, but used to hedge foreign exchange risk, but nonetheless is relatively indicative. But this red part here is other non-bank financial institutions, which has grown an enormous percentage since the GFC. And the reason for that is that public markets have, like buying shares or whatever, have got really efficient, which means that there's relatively little potential to make excess profit, because if there was, someone would have already priced the asset correctly. Like most assets are roughly priced at their expected return. So because those markets are so efficient, it's very difficult to make a return. But private markets, therefore, have received more of an allocation because firms think they can make higher returns because the market is less efficient. I want to touch on financialization here, which is when you have a whole bunch of like financial firms financially engineering different financial products. And like a financial product is basically always of the form, I will receive some money and then pay out some money in the future, or I will give you some money and then return some money. But there's lots of kind of complicated financial engineering. They slice up all of the future cash flows from an asset, and you might get the cash flows that come first and you have like a more senior claim on that, or you might get the cash flows contingent on some outcome. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but broadly, you can engineer the cash flows out of a financial asset in a lot of different ways. And the reason that that's good is that if you've engineered the cash flows coming out of an asset in various ways, then the cash flows seem more appealing to final buyers of that financial asset because it more meets like their risk or their return requirements. And if it's more appealing to them, they're more willing to buy it. So if the final owner is more willing to buy it, then the initial issuer or the initial buyer who's going to sell it to the final buyer is more willing to initiate that loan, originate that loan, which means that there's more capital that is available for the firm who wants to issue it, right? So if I can take a whole pool of loans and slice up all the cash flows into a mortgage-backed security in a way that makes it more appealing to investors to own, then because the investors are going to want to buy it off the bank who originated it more, the bank who originated it can originate more, which means that I'm more easily able to get access to a mortgage because a bank wants to give me more money in a mortgage. So that chain of logic explains why financialization increases the access to capital. The second thing is that it helps firms reduce risk. So most firms are pretty risk averse. Their level of risk tracks with their level of investment. So if for any given level of investment, I can use financial products to reduce the level of risk I'm exposed to, then I allow for more investment, which explains why financialization is broadly good. So that's the capital market. That's the first half of this problem, is how much capital do we have access to? Now, capital has to interact with labor to make stuff. What impacts the amount of labor? The first is the number of people who are able to perform labor. So for instance, immigration increases that number. For instance, labor force participation. So making sure that women are able to enter the labor force and actually participate increases the level of productivity in the overall economy. And obviously that number is a lot higher than it was 50 years ago. The second thing is the skills of the people in the labor force is very, very important. So their level of education is very important. How well your tertiary university sector does is very important. How well your schools do is very important. And it's also important that firms invest in education as well, invest in educating their workforce. And there's lots of debates where there's an argument about skills. And the changes that firms will make in their incentive to invest in their employees. The third thing is the general well-being of the population. So a population who is more well-fed is likely to be more productive labor. So that's how you end up with more productive labor. The next question then is how well can you match labor to capital? How well can you ensure that the amount that the labor goes to where it can be most productive? Because each combination of a worker and a job has a certain productivity, and that's going to change depending on who the worker is and who the job is. And the game we're trying to play is how do we best possibly match the pair of workers to the pair of jobs, such that how do we best match the worker to the job such that we maximize the overall productivity? The problem here is that very often that trades off against the working conditions, because usually a more fluid set of matches, i.e. I can change jobs more easily, or the employer can change who holds that job more easily, will be more efficient because it can more easily change to what is the most efficient way. But that also leads to more job uncertainty because I'm more likely to get fired, which is a harm in and of itself, right? Workers feel uncertain, which is terrible for them. So this trades off against workers' interests, and in particular, it trades off against all workers' interests because no one wants an unstable job. But in particular, it trades off against the interests of the people who currently have the job, who maybe it's good for the unemployed person who gets their job, but that's zero sum, the number of people who have the job, and then everyone's utility is just reduced by uncertainty. But it especially trades off against the workers who currently have the job, which is why the unions who represent them often take incredibly large steps to make sure that there isn't flexible matching. So this explains how good matching for an efficient labor market often trades off against a worker's rights. And there's lots of things that influence how effective matching are. Things like non-compete clauses, which make it so that workers aren't able to move to new jobs as easily, make matching worse. Although there's a good argument that they make investment in human capital better, because if you have a non-compete clause and they can't go work for a competitor, maybe you're more likely to train them up. So you can see how things trade off against each other here. Laws that make it difficult to fire people, obviously good for workers who are more certain of their job, but bad for the labor market matching efficiency. Or wage setting as well is bad, because the logic is supposed to be the worker goes to the job where they can make the most money. The firm that's willing to pay them the most is where they will be the most productive. So the worker is incentivized to go to the highest paying job, which is good for the worker, but it also aligns everyone incentives because you get the most efficient labor market matching. And that also explains why you want lots of people to have access to jobs. So for instance, why it's good to have good public transport, because you can most have people travel to where the jobs that they want to have are. Why it's good to have online jobs, because it means that people aren't constrained geographically. Why it's good to have free movement of people across borders, because people can go to the job where they are most efficient. In terms of the wage setting, I think there's an interesting example here. There's a debate about capping CEO pay that you see a lot. And the way that like I would get up and do that from the neg is just be like, well, CEOs make a lot of difference to how productive a company is. We want the CEOs to be allocated to the companies where they are the most productive. the company where they are the most productive will be the most willing to pay them because they'll pay for that extra productivity. So by ensuring that we have by ensuring that CEOs can get paid what they are worth to the firm, we also ensure that the CEOs are allocated to the firms where they can make it the most productive, which increases everyone's productivity. So that's matching efficiency. And then when you have more productivity, that flows through to people, because competition for workers means that if you aren't paying the worker as much as their productivity, another firm will offer more for that worker. Either they'll go to the new firm and get paid their productivity, or their initial firm will give them a raise, and then they will get paid what their productivity is. So that's how it flows through. That isn't always true. For instance, sometimes you have a monopsony, which is where there's only one firm that's able to hire the workers, so they're not exposed to competition for those workers. But in general, that's how the story should work. So that establishes how much stuff we can make. The second relevant question there is, how do we distribute the stuff that we can make? So the mechanisms for distribution also impact productivity is the problem. So often mechanisms which lead to more equal distribution lead to lower productivity. And kind of the big idea here is that the greater share that you give the people who are the most responsible for wealth creation, so the people who hold all of the capital, the people who have the highest human capital, which is the term we use to refer to, for instance, people's skills, the larger share of their production that you give them, the more they'll want to produce. But the worse it is for inequality, because then you're not redistributing the gains. And obviously, each country needs to make a decision about where on that curve does it sit, where on the trade-off. Clearly, you don't want to give, you don't just want the maximum amount of stuff. You'd have lots of people dying in the streets and be poor. But clearly, you don't want to redistribute everything, because then there's no incentive to make anything, and everyone will be poor as well. But there's an optimal point on that trade-off curve, and states can make that. And there's true relevant questions for where you sit on the trade-off curve. The first is a technocratic one, which is, how much does each of these two things trade off against each other? And then the second one is one of values, which is, given we know how much productivity we can get for any given level of redistribution, what is the correct balance for our values as a nation between productivity and redistribution? So you might say, for instance, the United States has a culture which preferences productivity over redistribution, and as a result is far more unequal but far more productive than, say, Europe, which has a culture which is far more redistributed but less productive, which is why they are on net poorer but are far more equal than the United States. So there's a couple of mechanisms that impact this. For instance, taxation impacts this. So taxation clearly is redistributive because you can spend it on the poor people, but it also deters economic activity, which means that you get less production overall. Industrial relations policy is another one of these. So industrial relations policy increases costs for firms because they have to pay their workers more because it's harder to fire their workers, so they can't match as efficiently with the best workers, as I explained before. So it's bad for productivity, but it's good for workers who get paid more and now are less likely to get fired. So there's lots of these sets of trade-offs that we need to try and figure out where we should end up best. So let's now finish off by sort of applying some of this to some common econ debate scenarios. So the first thing to say is that even in non-economics debates, thinking about the first part of this presentation, which is how do agents maximize utility, is very, very often the correct way to think about the debate, and will clarify your thinking about how that debate should work. The second thing to say is that there's often an economics argument on non-economics debates. So for instance, at a mini a couple of weekends ago, I got a motion in one round that was about, should we have, I think, conscription? And then I got a motion about whether or not humans should finish being fertile at the age of 30. And from negative in both debates, I ran an argument about human capital formation and saying that this policy would mean that people would not be able to develop as many skills. So my argument on conscription was that you take people out of the workforce at the key time when they're most developing skills junior in their career. And the argument on the fertility debate was that if you forced women to have children when they were much younger, those are the key years when you're forming your skills, which would mean they'd be less able to form that human capital. It would be better if that happened later. But those are obviously not economics debates, but they, to me, have very clear and intuitive economic arguments that you want to run. There's lots of arguments about policy that changes how we provide things to people, that changes their general level of well-being, which changes their labor productivity, or changes their ability to engage in the labor force. There's very often an economics argument. Okay, a couple of common economics debates then. First of all, nationalization debates. So the key question in a nationalisation debate is usually, is the market efficient at producing things? Because clearly a market is going to mean that the consumer has to pay both for the cost of producing a thing and then also for the profit margin that the firm makes. Under nationalisation, you just have to pay for the cost of producing the thing because the government isn't taking out a profit, they're just taxing you and then providing the service. The question is, but the reason that we would, in general, not for everything to be nationalised, even though they have to take out a profit margin, is that they are sufficiently more productive when done in the private sector because you have the market allocating than the public sector, such that additional profit margin is very low and is outweighed by the fact they're just more efficient at producing things. Because they tend to be more efficient because they have the profit incentive to produce things more effectively, because the market is able to allocate things to where it's needed. So for instance, the market will only produce as many tiles as the market demands, whereas the government might not know how many tiles the market demands because they lack the price signal that the private sector does, so won't be able to produce the correct number of tiles versus the correct number of sheet metal for roofs or whatever. Because the idea is that the market sees how much something is costing and then comes to an equilibrium where the amount that it costs to produce is equal to the amount that is being paid, and then that's how they correctly allocate, whereas the government lacks the price signal to do that. So the question is that market actually efficient at providing that thing? So do the consumers know what they want? So for instance, some markets might not be efficient because you might say that a lot of markets for medicine aren't super efficient, which is why you need publicly provided medicine, because the people using it don't know what they want. They have to rely on the doctor. And if the doctor is telling them what has a financial incentive to tell them what to buy, then there's clearly a conflict of interest. So in that case, you might say the market's not efficient. You might say the market's not efficient because there isn't sufficient competition. There's not enough people who can enter, and there's reasons we can't make that better because it's often called like a natural monopoly, which is something that is just sufficiently more efficient when it's only run by one person because the scale benefits are sufficiently large. So you want to figure out whether or not the market is efficient in nationalisation debates and decide whether the trade-off of having it nationalised is worth it to just, in the case where the market is sufficiently inefficient. Secondly, on market intervention. So often what you're trying to explain here is why the market is inefficient in some way. So why the logic that I raise here about the market, efficient markets, breaks down. Why is it that there isn't competition for firms who can compete against each other? Why is it that consumers don't know what they want? You have to explain why there's a particular market inefficiency. But then you're not just trying to explain why your comparative in this case isn't explaining why the government would be better than the market. Your comparative is explaining why your intervention in the market fixes it and that the distortion to the market that it causes is smaller. Thirdly, competition debates. Often debates about like whether or not we want larger firms or whether we should break up particular firms. And often the benefits that you're weighing off against each other here are scale benefits against competition benefits. So a competition benefit is there's more firms who therefore can compete against each other to provide more better services. You get a higher diversity of services, but there's also benefits to scale. It's better when firms are bigger, they can access economies of scale. They're often good for innovation because large firms can cross-subsidize for parts of themselves that aren't as efficient. So for instance, lots of firms need to lose money early on in order to develop and get to a sufficient amount of R&D to be profitable. But that's helped a lot if you're owned by a conglomerate who can afford to fund you losing money for a long time, and is harder to do if you're out on your own, because then you have to, for instance, try and access venture capital or other kinds of loans. Fourthly, industrial relations debates. Once again, we're just applying very, very simple ideas here, which is industrial relations debates typically provide more benefits for employees on one side, but on the other side, they are worse for firms, so you're going to get less investment, and they're worse for the efficiency of the market, which means that it's much less productive. And there's lots of different forms of that debate, but the crux of the debate is the same. We're trading off against workers' interests against the interests of the broader economy. Regulation debates, also very, very similar, which is there's often some bad thing that's happening, often not to workers, or I mean, I guess industrial relations is a form of regulation, but this dot point is, I suppose, about regulation debates that are not industrial relations regulations debates, which is there's some outcome that firms that are doing are negative. We could stop it with that piece of regulation, but that would also have an impact on the firm's ability to provide goods to consumers and for all of the logic that I've talked about here, talked about earlier to apply. So you need to trade those two things off against each other. You also sometimes get state formation debates, which is like, should X state be the same? In which case there's arguments about the size of the market. So all of the stuff that I've talked about how markets are efficient because they can efficiently allocate capital because they maximize. So that's in the second part about the capital market, or the fact that they provide the most choice to people. For instance, in the first section, when I'm talking about people maximizing their own utility through choice, if you have a larger market, there's more choices for firms to get capital. There's more choices for people to get jobs. There's more choices for people to buy goods. So all of the allocation should be way more efficient. And markets tend to be bounded by states, although obviously there are things like free trade agreements. The other issue that you get is often monetary policy, because where states have the same monetary policy, although that isn't always within a state, sometimes you have central banks at an above national level. But where you have monetary policy coming together, I noted in the section about the short run that you change your monetary policy to reflect particular problems. So for instance, you cut interest rates when the economy is struggling in terms of output. You raise interest rates when the economy is struggling because of too much inflation. So the ideal setting for that changes a lot on your circumstances. So it makes sense that places which have correlated circumstances have very, very similar monetary policy as well. But if your circumstances aren't very correlated, then it can be a problem, because I might have a different circumstance to you, and then the central bank can't do the right thing for both of us. So one of us gets screwed. It would just be better if we had our own central banks. The other thing about monetary policy compatibility topics is that you often want a state to be in charge of its own monetary policy. And the reason for that is that states which are in charge of their own monetary policy are also able to control their own currency. And the reason those two things are linked is because, as I explained previously with the exchange rate mechanism, let me scroll back up to it here. Monetary policy transmission. When you change your monetary policy, you also change your exchange rate. So if your interest rate goes up, then it's quite likely that your currency would also go up, because more people are going to want to buy your bonds, which is why there's a link between your ability to control your own monetary policy and your ability to control your own currency. Because if you want to maintain a currency peg at a certain level, you can't move your interest rates too much, because if you're trying to maintain a currency peg, essentially what you have is the central bank saying, okay, we're going to agree to trade our currency at this rate with another currency in perpetuity. And because we will do that exchange, obviously we will be able to maintain that market rate at all times. The issue with that is that then you can't move your monetary policy too much, because if the rate that you've pegged your currency at is below what the demand for what the market price would set for your currency based on the demand for that currency created by your monetary policy, then you're going to rapidly run out of the ability to do that exchange at that pegged rate as a central bank, because lots of people are going to come to you asking to do that exchange, and then you're going to run out of foreign currency reserves to be able to do that exchange. So that's why there's a link between you having control of your monetary policy and you having control of your currency. Final kind of common debate is free trade debates, which are, should everyone trade? Now, almost all of the logic I've given you in this presentation would suggest, yes, there's larger markets. You can get capital flowing to the correct places. You can get goods flowing to the correct places. And I didn't cover it in this because I felt this was long enough as it is. But the other important thing here is the theory of comparative advantage, which is that you should have the state producing a good who can produce that good with the least trade-off to their ability to make other goods. And then everyone makes the thing that they're efficient at making, and we get the most stuff, rather than everyone having to make exactly the set of things that is demanded by their internal population. And then since we have an allocated production to the people who can produce it the most efficiently, we get less stuff overall. The logic that goes against that is that what's good in the long term isn't always good in the short term. So, for instance, it might be true that we could be super efficient at producing some good. The problem is we just don't have a developed enough industry yet in it because as I've covered, there's scale benefits. You can produce things more cheaply when you're larger. Because of that, if you're smaller, you have a hard time competing with firms that are larger. So even if you could potentially be productive into the long term, make lots of money for your country, you're probably not going to be able to because you can get outcompeted. Which is why you often give tariff protection or subsidy protection to domestic infant industries so that they can develop, and then once they're sufficiently developed, you take off the tariffs and the subsidies and they're able to compete on their own. And now you have a productive industry because the market wasn't ever able to, even though it would have been efficient, the market wasn't ever able to take a long-term enough view to make them efficient. To develop the industry to make it efficient, because obviously governments operate at an enormous level of scale. So that's the argument against it. Although I will note in practice, it can often be very difficult once you have developed an infant industry with subsidies and tariff protection to take off the tariff protection or take off those subsidies, because people tend to get quite mad, particularly the unions and the workers who work there. So I think what you should take away from this kind of section, and that's the end, is there's a whole bunch of common idioms that you kind of see in economics debates. None of them are that complicated. They're all just applying a very kind of simple set of ideas that I've covered in all of the rest of this presentation and applying them to those motions. None of these arguments are very complicated at all. And once you understand the basic ideas, you're really just talking about applying one or two simple concepts per debate. And honestly, that'll carry you more than far enough in debating. I'm sure some people have made very, very complicated economics arguments, but I very rarely see it. The best economics debaters in the world just run very simple arguments from very simple first principles. All right, that's the end. That's all I have to say. I don't actually know how long time-wise was budgeted for this, but if I've gone over, apologies. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, head off and enjoy your day.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
So what's your take, or what's your opinion on universal basic income for people? There's a debate going on regarding the idea that if AI usurps quite a lot of people's jobs, then universal basic income can be a prospect. So how does economies or market will change if that happens?
So a lot of what I have produced here, a lot of what I've talked about here relies on the idea that it relies on a couple ideas. The first is that it relies on scarcity, because I've talked a lot about markets allocating goods to people, and also about markets allocating capital to where we can most efficiently produce stuff. And then the argument is, as we've done that, we produce more stuff, and then we have to distribute that stuff. So if there isn't scarcity because there was so much stuff, then in that case, I think you would have to look at, you no longer need the market to efficiently allocate that stuff. So maybe something like a universal basic income makes sense. The second thing that it relies on is that it relies on the distribution mechanism that I discussed before, because most of the way that all of the stuff that I've talked about with respect to productivity, really the final crunch point for that, the final funnel that it has to get through is at some point that productivity has to get back to a worker. And the underlying assumption for basically all of the world right now is that the reason it gets back to a worker is that a worker is needed to make the thing, and therefore we have competition to hire that worker, and therefore we'll pay them and they'll get a share of their production. But obviously the scenario that you're talking about would be one in which their worker was no longer required. So the funnel, that mechanism to actually get it down to everyone, fails. So in that case, I think two core pieces of logic of everything that I've talked about don't super make sense. And in that case, maybe you look at an alternative transmission mechanism, like a universal basic income, because you need some way to get the money to people, and because you don't care about the distortion of massive taxation to do it, because we're in a post-scarcity society. But I will say, I think we're talking about a world that is fundamentally very different to the one that we live in today. I think that's a policy that is for a monumental shift in the world economy, far larger than anything we've seen, certainly in our own lifetimes, or probably in the last couple of 100 years.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Oh, can you kindly recommend YouTube channels, books, podcasts, or videos we can use for further learning? So I have one big recommendation, which is you should subscribe to Matt Levine's daily, that's like a daily newsletter called Money Stuff, which is not really economics. It tends to be more kind of corporate finance. But like, as obviously I've gone through a lot of corporate finance concepts today, and that's because it's really important to economics, right? Like corporate finance is the mechanism by which we allocate capital. Allocation of capital decides how much stuff we make. So it's really, really important. Yeah, that's the link. That's my kind of big recommendation. Yeah, I think there's nothing else that I have enough faith in. I think the Substack Aprecitas Economics is also very, very good. It's by a guy called Joey Politano. I think that's really, really excellent. But those are the only two that I have enough faith in to feel like I can confidently recommend. All right. Seems like that's it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.